afternoon, and welcome to the Concord Bookshop. I want to start with a little story. I'm a golfer, and I used to play all the time on this beautiful golf course in California, which was also home to large flocks of geese. My wife and I were teeing off on the 10th hole. My wife hit a drive and clobbered a goose as it was coming across the fairway.
Did you know that, Joanne?
Now she was pretty upset because it was probably her best drive of the day. The goose got up, shook itself off, flew off, probably to make a mess of a different part of the golf course. One of the marshals came by. My wife said, you know, I hit a goose. He goes, did you kill it? And she goes, no. And so he drove away and began muttering something about swinging harder next. Now, the goose survived. Joeann Hart's new novel made me wonder what would happen if the goose didn't recover. Her hilarious books describes the aftershocks of Goostercide at the exclusive Eden Rocks Country Club, which happens to be somewhere west of Boston, strangely enough. Her essays and short fiction have appeared in many different venues, including Columbia, the Roanoke Review, the MacGuffin, Prairie Schooner, and the Boston Globe. This is her first novel, and so now, please welcome to the Concord Bookshop, Joeann Hart.
Thank you, everybody, for coming on this gorgeous day. To be sitting inside, listening to words. Thank you, Bert, Jill, Concord Bookshop, for having me. This is great. Well, now you know the book is about starts off with a Canada goose being hit by a golf ball, does not survive, and then the things at the country club just go from bad to worse quite quickly because of that, and everybody's affected by the death of the goose and the overpopulation of the geese, and there's a lot of concern about not the goose population, but the membership population and the bloodlines and fraternity and things like that. So I'm so happy there's members of the Raymond Street Writers Group here today who saw me through a great deal. I mean, a huge bit of this book, chapter by chapter by chapter. I can't say enough about how wonderful writers groups are, because then they come to your readings too. So, so I'm going to do I'm going to read probably for about 15 minutes, and then we'll do some question and answers. I'm going to read 3 short sections, sort of amuse-bouches, that could introduce you to a number of the characters. And the first section I'm going to read is Charles Lambert, who is the gentleman, the member at the club who had the bad golf swing and killed the goose. And then we'll meet his wife and Arietta Wingate, who is the matron of the Eden Rock Country Club. And then we'll end with Vita, who is the chef of the club. So, without further ado, so this is Charles Lambert, getting ready to take his shot. Charles waggled his club and breathed in deeply as he relaxed his hands, but then a chunk of air lodged at the base of his throat. How had a moment of peace degenerated so quickly into another opportunity for anxiety? He shifted his weight to his left foot and rotated his shoulders. At least he was tall, not shrinking yet, and that gave him an edge. Even an inch or two made a difference in being able to assess the lay of the land. He could see, off in the distance, that old duffer Howie Amory disappear into the dog leg of number 16. And over there, a stately parade of Canada geese was marching up from Oxbow Lake. The birds acted like they owned the place, posing in their formal attitudes, luxuriously plucking at the green turf. If they could hold a club with those feathered limbs, they'd be better than he was by the end of the summer. It used to be his fortunes that were on the rise. Now it was his handicap. But a man's game only improved in proportion to the time available to work on it, and since his 50th birthday he felt he had no time at all. He readjusted his grip and felt the scorecard in his pocket dig into his groin. He could sense his partners shifting uneasily as they ran out of small talk, waiting for him to take his shot. Greg, Nettie, and Andrew, all friends and colleagues, had only a 2-minute reserve of conversation, even amongst themselves. That is, unless they were involved in some sport, so they wouldn't have to look at one another, but only look at the ball and discuss the ball, what the ball did, why it did it, and what could be done to either encourage it or keep it from doing it again. It could be a golf ball on Saturday morning, or it could be a baseball tuned into the radio in an air-conditioned Land Rover. It could be a football on a home theater screen as they fended off another sleety New England winter on tufted leather sofas. They could even be entertained by a day-glow tennis ball soaring over the heads of their wives in mixed doubles. The ball made them happy, but it had to keep moving. It made them nervous when it stopped for too long, foreshadowing the inevitable day when it and they would stop moving altogether. Charles wrapped himself in a tight cocoon of concentration as he raised his club high, determined not to hesitate at the apex, hesitated anyway, and swung. The contact reverberated through his body as if he were sending a piece of himself into the universe, soaring. Up and up, the small white Voyager sailed through the blue sky as through a heavenly sea, and his mind's eye followed along, looking at the course from high above, down at the giant amoebas of putting greens, the luxurious tops of trees, the reflective gaze of water hazards, all fitting together like pieces of a master puzzle. Then the ball and the vision began to fall from flight, plunging down and down again until the pieces broke apart. Nettie gasped in an asthmatic wheeze, simultaneous with the distant squawk. A grazing Canada goose fell over in a violent gesture, then went still. The golfers, too shook to laugh, stared at the inert body in the distance and waited to see if maybe it wouldn't decide to get up and shake off the whole affair. When they realized that such was not going to be the case, they walked over in trepidation, stepping over the divot. Charles got there first and squatted by the goose, spread in supplication on the flawless grass. He was about to touch it until Andrew, slight and sandy, put his hand over his mouth and shook his head. Holding his 3-iron like a harpoon, Charles prodded the feathered body until it rolled over, causing the head to settle at an unnatural angle. Blood appeared at its nostrils. "How disgusting," said Andrew, scrunching up his face, an act that made his Adam's apple protrude even more. "Well done, Charles," said Nettie, laughing. He lowered his fire plug of a body and tugged at a wing feather. What a pity hunting season doesn't open for another 6 months. Greg, a massive hulk of a human, bald and bubblegum pink, got his best club out of his bag, the USGA's rules of golf. "You can't play the game without knowing the rules," he always said. He began to pace, digging his cleats into the turf with every lumbering step as he turned the pages, searching for an answer. Andrew, abnormally upright by orders of his doctor and chiropractor, who catered to his tight, flinching spine, stepped away from the body and pulled a cell phone out of his pants pocket. Phones were forbidden on the course, but then again, as he often pointed out, so was foul language. And besides, he kept the phone on vibrate and only made outgoing calls when he had to. He dialed the grounds crew to clear away the mess. Charles collapsed to a one-legged kneel, using his club as a staff to balance himself. He pressed his lips together and tasted blood where his cracked tooth had rubbed at his inner flesh, and he stared at the bird. The feathers of one wing were spread open like a fan, the tip pointing up, beckoning him. The bleakness and terrible reality of existence seeped into his very being, all on this fine blue day, played upon the smooth green grass. He'd been aiming for the other side of the fairway altogether. How was one to go on with the game? Charles. And here we're about to meet his wife, Madeline. But Arietta Wingate is waiting for her in the library of the club. This is chapter 3. It's called The Rules of the Game. Every chapter has got a name to it that's a golfing term. Arietta Wingate had skin the color of egg whites, with hands as smooth and veined as a good Stilton. Her eyes were a striking Nordic blue, fringed with lashes thick with mascara. She touched her downy hair to check for loose strands, but found it perfect, as always. With the help of her cane, she inched her chair next to the library's fireplace, whose Verde Antico marble mantel was carved with Roman divinities. The fire she'd requested seemed token in its cavernous maw, which was large enough to roast a heretic. Yet the small flame was necessary, because even in July the paneled room was raw, receiving only the weakest sun through the casement windows framed in heavy velvet. The fire also served, as Arietta well knew, as a heavy-handed symbol of the hearth. She sat with care, adjusting herself on the relic beneath her, then arranged her burgundy linen skirt around her legs. The furniture was positively punitive, but she would not have it changed. Gerard Wilton, that wheedler, once broached the subject with her, explaining that if he put cushions on the rush seats, the committees might actually want to meet in there, the room for which such events were intended, instead of in the lounge. Only the Board of Governors met in the library, and then only on rare occasions for the privacy of formal vote-taking. That the others held their meetings elsewhere was fine with Arietta. She'd just as soon have the place to herself and her teas, and even now, waiting for Madeline Lambert, she enjoyed the library as her own. The stained glass lamp over the table glowed, darkening the recessed shadows of the wooden ceiling as coffered as a honeycomb. The ambient light washed over the smoke-stained portraits of past club presidents along the walls, casting them deep in thought. The door creaked. "Hello, Arietta." Madeline waved away a dark puff that rose from the hearth when she opened the door. Then she locked it behind her, slapping the heavy deadbolt in place with the edge of her hand. Madeline, dressed in straight gray slacks and tan blouse with a pink cameo at the collar, was a handsome woman, thought Arietta, with her good posture and elegant profile. A smile would make her beautiful, but composure was much the better. It was odd now to think of what a shock it had been back in the late 70s when Charles brought her home to the club, an unnaturally blonde and outgoing California girl whose own mother had never even married. Good Lord, who knew how the daughter would behave? But Charles had chosen wisely, because after only a few blunders, casual touching, singing to herself, a preference for revealing clothes, Madeline had fit right in. Even her blonde hair had mellowed into light brown with professional highlights. Madeline kissed Arietta on her suede cheek. "You're looking well today." "Traffic?" Arietta asked in a corrective tone, pretending, as always, that she'd been kept waiting. But Madeline was punctual to a fault. Even as they spoke, they heard 4 bells from the church in town, and they both glanced instinctively at the imposing grandfather clock, which could neither confirm nor deny. It had come with the house, complete with steeples and brass fittings, inlaid with bits of ivory and Roman numerals. It had everything but time. The clock had stopped at 6:30 during World War II, when there was no one on the home front to fix it. Afterward, in the post-war years of high suburban living, the Furnishings Committee, an elite subcommittee of House and Grounds, decided it was more charming to let the clock be, so they would not be pestered at parties by its insistent chimes, reminding them of the ephemeral nature of their fun. "You know I'm exactly on time." Madeline sat down in a peaked chair, which was so Gothic it might have been stolen from a parsonage. "Let's move on now, dear. We don't want to be caught short before Ellen Bruner arrives." She peered closely at Madeline's shirt pocket. "What is that?" "Oh, Madeline pulled out a prickly sprig of tight white rosebuds, the heads already limp. I forgot all about them. I pinched them from the garden this morning. Toss them in the fire before they look any worse. Arietta unscrewed the brass pistol handle of her cane and pulled at an exquisitely ornate key. Madeline looked at her sprig. It was too late to revive the blooms, wasn't it? She placed it on the little flame, where it hissed rather than burned. Arietta held the key out to Madeline by its red silk ribbon like a hypnotist, then pulled it back. "Did you lock the door?" she asked. "You watched me do it." Madeline was slightly exasperated that after all these years, Arietta still questioned her capability. She took the key from her and walked to the distant corner of the library, near where the papier-mâché globe stood on its intricate iron base, another original artifact. Arietta followed, tapping the oriental carpet with her cane, severing the indigo fibers from their warp. She pulled a chair right behind Madeline, who knelt before a cabinet. "Well?" Arietta leaned forward, both hands on her cane. Madeline was letting a moment of nausea pass, having lingered a while at the club the night before, drinking cake-batter martinis. That Beryl Hall, the woman kept close tabs on Boston's cocktail culture and passed her lethal teaching at Harvard, and and we kept actually to the Harvard schedule, the semesters, and it was a great thing to be able to write the novel with everybody's input as we all wrote it together.
And do they tend to be standalones, or is there an association or even a network of writers groups? My husband's an aspiring writer, and so
yeah, I know they're hard to track down. All I can say is that you've got to just keep asking everybody.
Keep your ears open.
Yeah, just keep asking. I know there's somebody else in this room too who's looking for a writers group. Maybe afterwards we'll talk.
Could be the beginnings.
Yeah, see if you're in the same geographical area. But I live in Gloucester. I traveled into Cambridge once a week to do this, middle of the day, because it was that important. And plus it gives you deadlines.
I should say that Joann was writing another book altogether when she started this, and I loved the other book as well. It was about girls and people growing up in a small back town, backwater town in the south.
That's a novel that I found out later is called a coming-of-age novel, and it sits in a drawer, and I had some nibbles on it with agents, but everybody said the same thing: can't do a coming-of-age novel, just won't do it.
Just too many out there?
There's too many out there. It's just sort of a cliche for a first novel to be a coming-of-age novel. It's also a novel that I did without a plot ahead of time. Bear that in mind, a warning to those that I really did just sort of meander through. And now that I know, if having a plot ahead of time sounds so forced, and that's not true. It just really gives you the structure to be free. So, so first novels, they're like pancakes. Throw the first one out. Sits in a drawer. My agent won't look at it. My agent too.
It had some absolutely wonderful characters and scenes in it.
I know, but it's not. Nobody would look at it. She said, "They're like pancakes." Out it goes.
Couldn't you just change their ages?
Yeah, I know. But then, if they're 50, they're too old to be going through
but
these.
we're continually growing up.
Yeah. Yeah.
That'd be midlife crisis novel, and they probably don't want that either.
Yeah. Well, except that Addled is.
Well, it is.
Basically, in a lot of ways. At least Charles, one of the characters, is a midlife crisis.
I love his concoction of a sculpture to display at the end.
That's where the forks and knives were going.
That's where the forks and knives are going. That's right. And oddly enough, since after I wrote it, while it was still in progress, I actually saw that sculpture. Yes, I really did. Somebody had done an eagle out of forks, and it was gorgeous. And it was in a corporate art gallery. It was real art, and it was beautiful.
An eagle is different from geese.
I know, an eagle's
and
very,
I like the geese better.
I know. It was pretty damn good eagle.
How did you think up all the names and the characters in the book?
Oh, well, sometimes I stole them, Humpy. I should apologize publicly because I stole his name, but I really needed the name because I was thinking of Humpty Dumpty and having the fall and
Yeah,
and the egg thing, you know, I'm working
Yeah.
the egg image. I'm sorry, you know, I had to take it. But basically, I've got whole documents and hundreds of names. And every time I hear or see a name that interests me, first and last names, I
Make a
just
note of that.
I've got to document hundreds of names. My most interesting names, and most of the names actually that came from Addled, were in the back of alumni magazines, yeah, of donor magazines, those annual reports, and
Yeah.
you see those thousands of names.
Yeah.
A lot of them are fascinating. You should see Vassar's. I went to Vassar's, Wellesley's, Harvard's. I went to a lot. It was great. It's a good place to get names.
Repeat with nicknames, of course.
Yeah.
What is your next work?
I'm just finishing up a collection of short stories based on real estate ads. So, yes, so those are almost done because I write a lot of style pieces for the Boston Globe magazine. I go into strangers' homes and write about them, and so this sort of comes from that because you can just tell so much about where people live and what houses they're buying. Soon, almost done.
Short stories.
Short stories. Short stories because, and I'll tell you why short stories, because I'd always written short stories. I do have a novel in my head that's coming, but this book was supposed to come out in spring 2006. And there was going to be this huge rush to get it done, and I didn't want to jump into a novel, which is this all-encompassing event. And so I thought I'd just sort of shake everything out with short stories and really got into it. And then the book we couldn't get the book done in time for 2006 and went all the way around. And it's just as well because now I pretty much have a collection, which I would have had a novel become. But it's good. They're different experiences, novels and short stories. And then I alternate with nonfiction as well.
What's your writing schedule?
I roll out of bed, and I after my husband makes me coffee, and has the support staff, and while I'm still sort of in a dreamy state, I'll write for 3 to 4 hours. And novels take a lot of work, a lot of time. Then you've got to be pretty religious about it. Sit there. Even if you're not feeling anything, just sit there. Just wait. Okay, thank you. Onto Enrico, the club's head bartender, whose dark face was as impassive as an executioner's. Beryl then forced these concoctions on innocent wine sippers like herself, who knew better than to accept, but she had succumbed out of politeness, as always. Looking back, it was just as well that Charles had made them leave early, or she would have gotten a good deal drunker. He'd been so antsy since that silly goose incident last week, and there'd been no arguing with him. But as she was leaving in her tipsy fog, she'd noticed Ellen Bruner conspicuously drinking sparkling water with lemon and patting her still flat stomach, making a case for pregnancy. It gave Madeline pause. She wondered if a lawyer might balk at recording the intimate details of her impregnation in the book, the club's biological genealogy as opposed to the merely legal. Maybe an attorney wouldn't see the law as being secondary to nature. "I'm a little worried about today," said Madeline. "I hope Ellen won't give us trouble." "Nonsense," said Arietta. "She's in family practice, isn't she? She'll see the reason for the book more than most." That reason was not to be found anywhere in the history of the Eden Rock Country Club. According to Arietta, there had been stiff competition when the club was being formed, with two men, Enoch Winship and Oliver Stallybrass, duking it out for president. Clethra Winship, a proper Victorian matron with an industrial-age temperament, extended certain courtesies to one of the incorporators, Granville Barker, who repaid her many kindnesses by voting for her husband. The upshot was that her family enjoyed the benefits of such a position in terms of social and business contacts. They were invited into all the right homes, which meant access to potential investors for Enoch's fledgling securities business, which meant more money, which meant more access, and on, a felicitous intersection of wealth and friendship. The only glitch had been the baby girl born the following season, who had the pointed little ears of a fruit bat, just like Barker's. When the girl was 10, Clethra got sick, and in her fever feared that her daughter, in her absence and in the closed world of the club, might marry one of Barker's children. Who could warn her that such a marriage could not take place? This is this little section here with Vita.
You've been sued yet?
She says she's been sued yet.
The impersonation of notable
Well,
people.
they'd have to know how to read, wouldn't they? Okay. Vita stood with her back to the stove, a line of computer-generated papers waving in front of her face like Buddhist prayer flags. She was simultaneously reading orders and giving orders in an atmosphere of pure rush and panic, but she exuded calm, like the duck who seems to glide without effort on the surface while its feet are madly churning below. It was the life of a cook, her life. The crazy hours, the intensity of the work, the beauty of the product. She thought of her crew, her sous chef, 2 prep helpers, dessert woman, 5 wait staff, 3 runners, and a busboy, as a single organism fighting for food. The kitchen was a room of hunger and desire, and Vita loved it because she, by and large, was the one person who could satisfy everyone. If only she could make her mother understand with what passion she embraced her job. Her mother, who she knew was obediently sitting by the phone at that very moment, waiting until the rush was over so she could call her daughter. "You do the shrimps," Vita said to Sloane, her competent but silent sous chef. "I'll take care of this." Sloane mechanically spooned tomato chutney into 2 large martini glasses, executing her duty like she was changing a tire, for all the food touched her soul. She did her job perfectly and bloodlessly. Vita reverently placed a hot squab on a plate and arranged sage and grapes around it. Ordinarily, she didn't handle appetizers, but this was for Dr. Nicastro, and he noticed every detail. She sent the dish up to the dining room as proudly as if she had hatched the pigeon herself. 2 waitresses argued over whose salmon plates were whose, and a waiter dropped a glass and cursed, and another asked where his veal was. Oops! Now that Vita had sworn off oil spray to freshen up food, she was cooking closer to the bone. She turned her attention to the pan of floured veal medallions on the counter, as scrumptious as powdered baby bottoms. She peeled a latex glove off her hand and gave the cutlets a loving pat, then chose 2 to throw into the hot pan in front of her. As she added a handful of shallots, she wondered, along with her mother, if she would ever pat the real thing. Children could be a mixed blessing. Phoebe Lambert, for instance. When Vita heard she was back in town, she put Boca burgers back in the snack bar to avoid another scene like last summer, when Phoebe lay covered in ketchup at the pickup window, lobbying for a beef alternative. Vita flipped the medallions and gave the shallots a stir. And as soon as word got out that veal had been on tonight's menu, Phoebe was sure to charge, but Vita was ready with a counterattack. This rosy meat had a pedigree even a vegetarian might approve. She turned the meat out on a plate and with a spattering of hot fat used Madeira to deglaze the pan. A warm, loving woman in upstate New York raised free-range calves, bringing them up like her own children. The animals lived bucolic, natural lives, right up until 9 months of age, when the woman, calmly and with compassion, slaughtered them. It was flesh of the highest quality and could be consumed with a clear conscience. She poured the glaze over the veal and placed a scoop of moral whipped potatoes on the side, not underneath, not being a fan of Viagra towers of food presentation. She wanted her food to be easily seen and admired, and not to make the members hunt for their starch. The waiter snatched the plate from her hand, her bare hand. Oops again. Reluctantly, she flipped another latex glove from a box on the counter. Gerard was a bear when it came to Department of Health regulations. It tore her apart to have this artificial barrier between her and her food, but she wore them when Gerard was on duty, and to set a good example for the staff, some of whom she wouldn't want touching her food with naked hands either. She gave the mussel soup with saffron a quick stir to keep it from settling, then prepared a plate of duck, arranging loganberries at the cut where the leg had joined the body, so the member would not be reminded that the bird once walked the earth as he did now, and sent it up. She ripped tendons from an uncooked leg with a flick of her knife to prepare it for the next order. Louisa came down the steps from the dining room holding a glass. "Spots! Mr. Stillington says spots. He raised it at me." Vita motioned to Pedrosa to lift the steaming tray of glasses from the dishwasher. Poor Louisa, to get Mr. Stillington her first night back. Everyone hated to wait on him, since every request came with a storm of abuse. The only comfort was that as hard as he was on the staff, he was even worse to his co-members. He treated everyone badly, as if that were the mark of being well-bred. But she'd been around long enough to know that talking about everyone badly while treating them like long-lost siblings was the gold standard at the club. And yet Gerard had assigned this monster to Louisa, setting her up to get her off the dining floor. Gerard would have to do better than that. She instructed Louisa to grab a spotless glass by its hot stem and place it on a linen-covered tray. Then she selected a split of Bordeaux and placed it next to the crystal. We should throw him a couple of Christians, but this might do. Vita was liberal with wine splits because they smoothed any dining disaster. The richer the customer, the more he liked free things. You just had to know how to tickle the stomach. Louisa thanked her in a rolling Spanish, and Vita corrected her. If the members hear you talk like that, they'll think you're plotting something. Learn to say thank you in English and learn to say it often, like Gerard. Louisa muttered El Sapo and laughed her way up the stairs with her offering. Toad? Vita shrugged and went back to her stove, turning the heat up on the duck. The duck, the squab, and the guinea hen with baby turnips and artichoke puree on the menu that night were all a pitiful excuse for the special game dinner featuring goose that she had hoped for. But last Sunday, Louisa's mother, Mrs. Suarez, had scoffed when Vita showed up with a domestic goose that had already been plucked and gutted so that it was no longer a candidate for hanging. Mrs. Suarez slapped the bird on its pimpled rump. Goose must live, must love. And with this she patted her heart. Taste is from life. Go make friends with your birds. Make them fat and happy. And a week before you want to eat, I bring my boys and we kill them. Yes? Kill them? Vita had gotten an uneasy feeling. Every ounce of meat and fish she had ever prepared and served had been killed by someone, somewhere, but not at her command. Or had it? When she ordered the veal through her supplier, was she not asking for the knife to be put to the calf's throat? How different was this? And it wasn't like she was going to see it happen. She would have no blood on her hands. The more she thought, the more intense her memory of Mrs. Suarez's goose became. She lowered her voice. How do I fatten them up? Thank you. Be happy to field questions, comments.
Are you a golfer? Or how did you learn all that?
Did you look online?
No, but I have to tell you that just by chance, I listened to a book on tape recently, a mystery that set at a fancy golf club in Pennsylvania, and there is some parallel spoofing.
I see. No, I've never played golf, and
So how
I
did you
had to
learn?
do hundreds of hours of research
Yeah.
to find out how to play golf. I read dozens of golf novels, read dozens of nonfiction golf books, read golf magazines. Yeah, it was a lot of work.
But so assiduously avoided playing.
Anything, anything but play. Because, I mean, playing takes up like a whole day. I mean, this is not like something you can just, I have played miniature golf. That is just about it. And it was, in fact, I was able to, the golf course, which I had in my head anyway, turned out to be this very famous golf course, the Country Club in Brookline, which in fact was the only golf course I've ever been to. And but that turns out it was very famous, and there's all these books written about it. So I was actually able to read and learn the entire, ball by ball, hole by hole by hole. I was able to learn, so that was great. There's lots of golf material out there.
And how about cooking?
Cooking, I cook.
Can I follow those recipes?
Pretty much, and in fact, I think they're online. There's some, or the menus online. I'm not sure recipes. And we have a farm. I in fact know how to butcher animals as well and do the hanging from beginning to end. So that I can do. Although the food in here is much fancier than I usually cook, so I also did some gourmet magazine, picked out fancier recipes than I would. But I also knew how then she would prepare the actual cooking. And I thought, how nice to have staff. Yeah. In a professional kitchen.
I have a question. Did you know from the beginning where it might end up, or did it develop chapter by chapter?
No, amazingly enough, from the beginning it was all out.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It still took 2 years to write. And in fact, I'd been gathering notes on it for many years, and not really sort of just subconsciously thinking about it while I was doing other work. And then one day when I was ready to start, I opened up the folder and I had 40 pages of notes and basically the plot. So I pretty much, I had the plot long before I had names even, but yet I had the characters all drawn out. So.
It's very funny. I really enjoyed it.
When I told our daughter that we were going to come hear this, told her about it, she said, I love the title, I've got to read it.
Oh, good.
Before she knew anything
And
else.
I had the title before I had anything else.
Wow.
Before I had a single note, I had the title.
It's a great title.
Yeah, and the first chapter I had almost as is from the beginning.
Wow.
Who's your favorite character and why?
Oh, I actually didn't read from my favorite character. Is Dr. Nicastro, who's actually the club's overweight gourmand, and Vita, she was sending the food up to him. We didn't actually get to meet him, but he was sort of the voice of reason. And so it was sort of every time I needed to step in and straighten things out, I did that through Dr. Nicastro. That he had his issues, but he really made more sense than anybody.
Hey Joann, when you won the Pen Award, was it for the first chapter of the book, or what was it?
I read this Addled won a Discovery Award in Fiction in 2004 because of the writers group. actually, because we hire an instructor, and the instructor happened to be on the nominating committee for this award. And so she'd seen it in progress. And so it was probably, no, she'd probably seen 2/3 of the book, and it wasn't complete.
So she then nominated you?
Based on what she'd
she'd
seen.
I see.
Right. Yeah.
Was this a writers group that you formed?
No, I was allowed to enter and had to get referrals about a very long established writers group.
Is this on the North Shore?
No, in Cambridge.
It was founded by
In
Ann
fact, our
Wyman.
founder is here, and it's called Raymond Street because where Anne lives, or lived at the time. So. Yeah. But it's a good way to do a writers group is to actually, you know, pool together money and hire an instructor. And we've, you know, hired people from